In this video, I'm going to talk about functions and concepts related with how to import data to R, as well as how to export data from R. The general situation typically consists of, say you have some sort of external file, and here this could be simply R. Typically, the way we're going to be interacting with it typically will be with some integrated development environment, such as RStudio. So the typical situation will be you have data in an external file, and then we need to bring that data inside R. So this is where we can use reading functions. Basically, it's importing functions. And then another typical situation is where you want to export, you want to save, you want to write, right? So different ways to think about output to external files. One important comment, I'm referring to the notion of data in a very loosely, in a very informal sense. So data, it could be effectively a data table file. It could be some external file containing the data that you're going to be analyzing, but it could also mean just information. It could be an R script. It could be maybe some image file. So just keep in mind when I'm using the word data in this video, in this session, I'm really using this word again in a very loosely defined informal sense. Let me go through a series of general considerations. The first consideration to keep in mind is every program, and this of course is applicable to R, that runs in your computer will always have what it's called a current working directory associated to it. What is the working directory whenever you are interacting with R? In other words, what is the working directory of your R session? This actually comes determined by how you launch R. And here there could be two typical situations. So the first one is when you launch R, and say we're gonna do that through RStudio. When you click on the application for RStudio, opening the application directly, what this will create is RStudio will launch. It's gonna give you access to R. And the working directory, in this case, let me abbreviate it as WD, your working directory, will be typically whatever directory was associated by default during your R installation. And this typically corresponds to your home directory. The other common situation is when you click on some file that is associated with R, and this could be many flavors of R files. For example, you could have a file called myscript.r, so this is supposed to be an R script. You could have a report document. Let's say this guy is an R markdown file, an RMD file. You could have perhaps another document in RNW, R no web format. It's kind of like the old version of RMD files, or some other file that in some sense, somehow, your operating system recognizes it and it associates that to R. So if you directly click on each of these guys, assuming that you have RStudio installed in your computer, RStudio will launch, and the working directory associated to that session will be the directory, in other words, the folder that contains the file on which you click. R actually has two main functions that are connected, that are related with the working directory. One of them is the function getWD, which, as you might guess, it lets you know what is your current working directory. And the other one is setWD, which lets you specify, which lets you change the working directory if necessary. So these are the two primary functions, again, just to either know what is your working directory or change or specify a different working directory. The last consideration, super important, has to do with two common situations, right? So whether you are working with, could be an R script that when you execute those commands, those are going to be executed on the console directly. So again, this is typically a situation when working directly with an R script. The other situation is when you are working with an RMD file and executing code chunks from the RMD. The important thing here to keep in mind is that the console will have its own working directory, again, WD for working directory. And this may not necessarily be the same as the working directory associated to the RMD file. Again, if you're working with an RMD file, its working directory will be the directory containing that file. Whereas the working directory, when you are interacting directly with the console, that may not necessarily be the same one as an RMD file. This could be, by default, this is going to be your home directory, or you could specify a new working directory with the function setwd. Let me now go through some of the main functions that allow you to handle those typical situations in which you have to import, in which you have to read in some data. So let's start first with, again, probably the most common case in which you're going to have some data table or more than one table. Again, by table, I'm meaning you have some data file, presumably in some spreadsheet-like format. It doesn't have to be in a spreadsheet, it's just simply some text file. But the idea here is that your data, let's assume that it's in a tabular or rectangular format. By this, I mean a spreadsheet-like format. Okay, so if you have data like this, then you're gonna have some associated file. Typical file extensions for this type of situations could be data.txt, plain txt file extension. Also very common, CSV, comma separated value files, data.tsv, tab separated value, or pretty much any extension, by the way. I've also seen .data extensions or .dat extensions, and this typically means that all of these guys are basically plain text files. The function in R that allows you to import them, the main function is the read.table function. Now, keep in mind that it has a couple of friends or a couple of sibling functions. They are all wrappers of read.table. The important ingredients, let me start with the mandatory ingredient. You need to provide the name of the file. And when I say the name of the file, it's not just the name of a file like data.dat or data.tsv, but it's also its location. So where that file is located in your computer or in an external remote computer. That's mandatory. More things, these are optional, but it's good to keep them in mind, is what's going to be the field separator. What is the character used to separate fields, to separate values? Then the decimal character, the character used to represent the decimal symbol. What are the characters that people are using to encode quotes, the quote or quoting characters? These could also be super important. Other common situation, what characters or how missing values are encoded, whether there is a, let me call it a row, right? So a first line with names of columns. This is also very common to find something like this. And the associated arguments in read.table and all its functions. So the field separator, this is the sep argument. The decimal character is dec. Then you have quote argument for quoting characters, na.strings to specify what are the strings. If there is more than one way to encode missing values, what are those strings? It's a character vector. The argument header, this is a logical flag, true or false, to indicate if the first row it's been used to provide names for columns. What are the associated functions, or what are the sibling functions to read.table? The most common one is perhaps read.csv, comma separated values. Now in Europe, it's very common to use not a comma as the separator, but a semicolon as a separator. And this actually can be handled with the CSV2 version. Perhaps more generically, you have the read the lim function. And associated to these guys, there is also the read FWF. This stands for fixed width format. It's another not so common version of tabular sets, but it's still possible to find out their FWF files. One more thing about the associated functions for reading tables. So again, this applies to read.table as well as all its friend functions, is that they all give you a data frame as an output. So in other words, every time you read a table, the way it's going to be implemented in R is going to be as a data frame.